Hi there. Welcome to our session, Gifted Educators as Change Agents, a playbook for equity-driven professional learning. My name is Angela Novak, and I am here with my fun and fabulous partner, Katie Lewis. And today we are going to talk to you about how we can be change agents in our spheres of influence through professional learning. So as we go into this, we are going to start with some assumptions, and that is that you have some assumptions about some prior knowledge. Those assumptions are that you know the general characteristics of gifted learners, and that gifted youth don't always exhibit these characteristics, and that in many districts, the teachers are the gatekeepers to gifted programs. And that is through teacher referral to the programs for initial screening, teacher recommendations or checklists in order to get into the program. So in many ways, either before testing, after testing, whether or not there is testing at all, even beyond the test itself. And we know there are issues with a lot of tests beyond that, but that the role of the teacher is still incredibly important to the screening process for gifted programs. And so that we know that our role as teachers, as educators, is incredibly important to the identification of gifted students and to the role of supporting gifted students throughout the process of gifted education, not just in the identification and referral process. And so we know that there are recommendations based on research, and that it is that targeted professional learning is absolutely critical for educators, including gifted educators, and that it needs to cover the specific characteristics that pertain to gifted students, and in particular, minoritized and traditionally marginalized gifted students, and also include strategies that will support these students. We also know that in particular, professional learning needs to be purposefully planned, that it follows research-based best practices, and that in these best practices, as we follow them, that there is the potential to have a significant impact on the recognition of gifted students, the referrals to the gifted program, and the retention of gifted marginalized students into in the programs even after referral and identification. So the work that we're going to talk about today is based on initially a chapter that was in the book on the left, Best Practices in Professional Learning and Teacher Preparation, and it was in the second volume of this book. This is the 3-book series that was an NAGC and Proofrock Press publication. I was one of the co-editors of this series, this 3-book series, but I was the second author of this particular chapter, along with the fabulous Katie Lewis. And this second iteration of the model is going to be released in a Roper Review article. We know it should be the next upcoming issue of Roper Review. I'm not sure when that's going to be, but it should be coming out sometime soon. And it's actually also going to be the model that you're going to see, the most updated model that's going to actually be on the next slide, is the basis for the book, which is the image on the right that is Empowering Gifted Educators as Change Agent, coincidentally, the title of this presentation, a playbook for equity-driven professional learning. And that is a Routledge book, and that is going to be out in the spring of this year. And so this is the model And if you've been to one of our sessions in the past, this probably does not look like the model that you've seen in the past, because like I said, this is a new iteration of the model. So this is our 4-zone equity-driven professional learning model. And today we're going to go through each of the zones with an explanation of the zone and sort of a example of what it can look like in practice. So the first zone looks at raising awareness of the inequities in student populations. And again, this is all through targeted professional learning. And this first zone is really beginning equity work. It's understanding the self, understanding the community, understanding the system. And we know that we can't start a conversation about equity with the question of if racism exists in the space, but by naming how it does. If we start by debating the if, then we're not ready. You've got miles to go before the organization is really ready to start this equity work. So we start by naming how the inequities exist, and we start by understanding the cultural norms that are present in the district that we're doing the work. We don't want to globalize and understand everything. We really want to understand this space and this place. And so this work is very, we use the word targeted a lot, and that means that it's very based in the space and place of the organization. And so we're understanding the cultural norms of our target population, and we're understanding the inequities that have been existing in this population. So the first zone is really not as specific to gifted, it's understanding the cultural context. And at the beginning of this zone, it's also really crucial to do work on understanding the person, understanding the self as well, both the self as the organization and the self as the individual teachers. The second zone connects culture to the manifestation of giftedness. And so that's where we're understanding how giftedness and culture impact each other, and understanding that intersection of identity and understanding those cultural manifestations of giftedness and the different identities of the students that are, again, in that community in which we're serving. In addition, we're looking at the systemic inequities on the students' educational experiences in that community. We know they're there. Again, we're not debating if, but we're trying to understand how the marginalized students in this community have been impacted in terms of their gifted services, in terms of gifted education. So we're looking at what has happened and how identities and how the marginalization of these identities have impacted these gifted students. And then in the third zone, we're looking both in step forwards and step backs, and how we can provide support to the teachers and the students both before and after identification, because we really want to mitigate and provide reparations against these and for these inequities. So we want to look at not just how do we help support and increase identification, but also how do we provide support and make sure that we are supporting retention in the gifted program. So we want to look at front loading experiences. We want to look at supporting instruction once they're in the program as well. So it is fully supported throughout, not just let's get kids to the program. Let's make sure we are actively supporting throughout the program. And then the fourth zone focuses on making connections with the families and communities of the marginalized, traditionally marginalized populations. And so this is really focused on active and meaningful partnerships, not a tourist approach to partnerships, not a once a month outreach and we say hi and we have taco night and then we move on our way. It's really about meaningful and genuine partnerships that are community engaged, not just community based. Now, these zones are all, you can see on the sides here pointing over, and this little lovely swirly going up, that really indicates that they're meant to be cycled through in an iterative process. And this is, again, all through professional learning, because it's meant that if we need to take some step up, step back, some wiggling around and going back through some of this material through professional learning, that's absolutely expected. We're not expected to master something and never return. We're not expected to understand something and never need to go back and go through some of the information again. We really need to go through and learn something, explore something, and then maybe go back to it, return to it, delve into it a little bit deeper. And so we really expect this to be an iterative process and really create this rotation of ongoing support that leads to systemic change. And so when we go through this iterative process, we see in these arrows moving both up and down that we have a change in educators' perceptions of inequities and a positive change in marginalized gifted populations. And part of the change process comes from a foundation in Thomas Guskey's work in where we see change in teacher perceptions. And that's after we see a change in student outcomes. And so we really need to see the change in the population before we get that true change in teacher beliefs. And so that's why we have to go through all of the process and have that support of teachers. And then on this grounding bar for the zones, we have our theoretical frameworks, and those are based in cultural responsive professional learning, equity literacy, and funds of knowledge. And so when we go through, and in both the book and in the Roper Review article, we have a really extensive explanation of these theoretical frameworks that our work is based on. In going through, and equity literacy is a lot of Paul Gorski and Katie Swalwell's work, and funds of knowledge is Mull et al.'s work in terms of going through and meeting those community needs. And so that is our revised model that has those theoretical frameworks and the teacher perceptions and positive change really built into it that you can see, which is, like I said, based on Guskey's work. So we're going to go through, that was the quick, in theory, if I'm ever quick, but that was the quick overview. And then we're going to go through an example, starting with a little kiddo named Shiloh.
So Shiloh would be an example of a student perhaps that you would have in your district. And so the idea here is you're thinking about this student not as the gifted specialist, but as a classroom teacher who has this child in their classroom and trying to decide, should I even refer this child for a screening? It doesn't necessarily mean that this child will eventually be identified for services, but the idea is to change our awareness of gifted characteristics. So if we look at Shiloh, we see that Shiloh lives with his grandmother on the reservation. He does not plan to pursue college as he prefers to stay close and work with his elders. His standardized test scores are in the top 5%, but his attendance record and his performance in the classroom, the teachers are considering retaining him. Shiloh seems to enjoy math, where he easily makes connections between mathematical concepts and calculates complex problems in his head. He stays after class to ask questions and learn more about concepts. So if we think about Shiloh as we go through today, you want to think about, like, what are the reasons a teacher would consider referring him versus what is the teacher most likely not going to do. Most of the time, Shiloh would not be moved forward because of our gifted checklist that we tend to be given about students and the fact that he has attendance problems. He's not really a motivated learner. So we're going to start with zone 1 and talk about what we would do.
So zone 1 is increasing educators' understanding of cultural norms and equity. And as I mentioned before, this really starts with the entry level equity work. And how does racism exist in this place? What are the inequities here and now in this place? And anytime we start with equity work, we begin with knowing thyself. And this is a really crucial point because who we are and how we present ourselves in the classroom as educators impacts every student every day in many seen and unseen ways. And everything that we do in seen and unseen ways has an impact. And we often forget about this a little bit as educators and don't realize sometimes the little comments or a simple gesture or something just said really quickly, and don't realize that it may have an incredibly large effect on a student. And so we always recommend when we start with any kind of training along these lines that we start with talking about our own cultures, our own identities, and having a time to stop and reflect and think about who we are and what we bring to the classroom, and take a moment to sort of check that aspect. And then we go on to think about who is our population. And we don't want to think globally, we want to think specifically. And so taking the population of the Native American in NAGC, we have the SIG, it's called the NANIP SIG, or Native American Alaska Native. I always get the acronym wrong. Native American, Alaska Native, and Indigenous people. I believe that's correct. And so that is the SIG that it's a great SIG to join. I'm a member of it. Like I said, I'm messing up on the acronym at the moment. But that focuses with learning more about the Native American students that we have. And so in this particular case, we think about the fact, what do we know about this population? And so if we're thinking globally, we think about, oh, okay, I think there's 566 recognized tribes. We can't think about this globally. We need to say, who is here? So if we're in the Pacific Northwest on the coast of California, there's the Yurok tribe. This is a very small group. It's on like I said, the coast of California. It comes inland. It's all along a river. And so if you're in that area, you have this very large population of Yurok. And so we want to know that culture, right? This is the specific culture that we're going to get to know. We're not going to, investigate all 566 at the moment. We're going to get to know the Yurok. And so we want to really hone in on who we know in our community and investigate the culture of this group, because we want to know who's in our class. Another good example in Florida, we need to know Puerto Rican, we need to know Cuban. We may not need to know as much about the Mexican population. And so just depending on where we are, we really need to hone in and get to know specific aspects of different groups. But we don't need to say, we're going to learn all about Hispanic, right? We're going to learn all about Latino. We need to know who is in the room, who is in our community. And it is a disservice to group all together. So specifically, when we talk about Native Americans, it's one of the least researched groups of students in the field of gifted education. Many attend school on reservation, and in terms of the way culture and academics work together, they're taught by white teachers or other outsiders to their cultural group. And there's a lot of stereotypes and overgeneralizations that are believed by people who are teaching them, such as, the group is always in poverty, that there are low high school graduation rates, that Native Americans tend towards violence and substance abuse and learning deficits. So there's these stereotypes that just exist, that when there is this stereotype and this natural bias, it can inform people's views before they allow the truth to come in. So there's this underlying bias that can truly affect a teacher's belief system before they even begin teaching a group of students. It's also important to know the cultural norms of the group, the matriarchal society, the collectivism in the group, the respect for elders, the importance of oral storytelling of the group, the focus on spirituality, this focus on the naturalistic society and the importance of earth and water, and the fact that there isn't a word for gifted in the language. There's not a translation. And if there is, it's the shaman or the holy man, or the medicine person in the tribe, the medicine man that's gifted, and that these gifts are bestowed upon them by a specific creator, and they are given these specific directions for utilizing these gifts, but it's not seen as academic. And so when we communicate, we might use different words than gifted, because these gifts are not the same as what is translated in their group, in their society, as gifted, because gifted is the shaman. And so it's really important to know how the communication, how you're communicating, and how it might be interpreted. And so it's not a big deal to use a different word, because it's important to make sure we're having clear communication and bridging that gap. And so what we do is, in this group, is go on to here. In this first zone, we really focus on understanding the self as that first step, like I said. And this is an example of when we start by taking the pulse of a group. We might determine that we need to have 3 different small groups for the first zone. And in this first PLC is a group that maybe doesn't have a lot of knowledge about, doesn't have a lot of background in a lot of equity, and doesn't have a lot of background in gifted. And the second group doesn't have a lot of background in equity, maybe has some background in gifted, but definitely not a lot about gifted and equity. And so they're sort of in a, what we might say, a middle group, right? And then this PLC 3 has a pretty good background in gifted and in equity. You know, they're not experts by any means, but they've got a fair background in both. And so it's a disservice, just like it is to our kiddos, to teach them all with the same resources in the same way. But we still want to come to a reasonable end game and reasonable objectives for everybody. So we say, well, let's create 3 groups. And so for zone 1, for this first PLC, we're going to again start with understanding the self, and we're going to unpack culture, unpack whiteness, talk about how they, as a person, influence their classroom. We're going to talk about how oppression and bias are seen in the school and how these impact NANIP students and families. We're probably going to need a little bit of extra scaffolding and some examples to really facilitate this conversation. We're going to provide some background knowledge through multiple modalities and get some global understanding of the group, and then narrow specifically to who's in our classrooms. And then we're going to guide the discussion around some conceptions and misconceptions and stereotypes around these groups, around who's in our community. In that second PLC, again, this group has a little bit more knowledge about some of these issues, but really probably has some more misconceptions to address, and we might need a little bit more help in some areas, but they've got a little bit more groundwork. And so we're going to still start with understanding the self, but maybe they need a little bit less scaffolding and maybe can go a little bit deeper in the discussion. So they've got that difference, right? So they're going to go more into intersectionality and really talk about upstander versus bystander. So that discussion is in that same general area, but it's going to go into a little bit different focus. So, and again, they're going to talk about oppression and bias, but because of that pre-assessment, we know that they are going to have different kinds of examples and maybe need a little bit less scaffolding during the discussion. And then again, we're going to go through some knowledge through multiple modalities about the groups. We're going to go into some a little bit deeper knowledge. And then we're going to introduce the funds of knowledge framework to this group. Notice we didn't introduce the funds of knowledge framework just yet to the first group. We're going to wait a little bit on that one for the first group. And then the third PLC group, they're going to have this dual role. They're going to serve as facilitators for some of the first two groups, but then they're also going to get extensions and go beyond in some other work. So they're going to get that funds of knowledge framework in a train the trainer model, and they're going to help facilitate some of the other groups, but they're also going to be given some extra information through multiple modalities to expand their knowledge on some of the topics in gifted equity and NANIP groups based on the pre-assessment, where they need some extra knowledge in small groups, just depending on where, based on the pre-assessment and based on their understanding, they really want to go. And then in zone 2, we're really going to focus specifically on giftedness within this population, both about those gifted characteristics as well as about those systemic inequities. And so here we talk about some of these, and let's think back to Shiloh for a minute. So some of these gifted characteristics, and Tamara Fisher-Alley is great for this work, and she's also in the NANIP SIG. She's a leader of that, so definitely check out the SIG. But some of these characteristics are curious, but not always question asking. They may wait and watch and learn rather than question and learn. Another characteristic is a gifted Native American child may adapt more easily with a foot in both worlds. So they can function easily and switch between both cultures, the Native culture and the mainstream culture of the school. They're more likely to ask questions after class rather than during class. And students, and this kind of goes back to adapting easily to a foot in both worlds, but they have aspirations to the contributions they want to make to their reservation and back to their tribe. And so those academic aspirations are folded into this comfort within their cultural group because they want to contribute back and take and tie those academic aspirations back to the cultural group, not go beyond. And so this is where I was saying that it's really easy to make a statement that you see, that someone may see as like a simple statement or a flippant remark, but that's really insulting, because one thing that is something that we've definitely heard stories of is a teacher, and this is sometimes labeled the savior complex or the white savior complex. It says something like, well, don't you want to, I'm going to help you, I'm going to support you, I'm going to get you off this reservation. Don't you want help being, getting out into the real world or getting saved from your life, and, something like this. And, taking this idea of where you are isn't good enough because of your potential. You're destined for greatness, which somehow means that the reservation isn't, right? I'm going to save you from this life. And that is incredibly affronting, incredibly insulting to the community, to the child who wants to come back and contribute to the life that the teacher just said is not good enough for them. So in this group, in this zone, remember that the PLCs 1 and 2, neither had a great foundation in gifted equity. So those two combined, right? And so they were okay in equity, gifted, the PLC2 was okay in equity, but they really needed more of a foundation in those gifted plus equity. So notice that these groups are combined. They didn't need to have that separate, those separate groups. And so you don't always have to have everything separated. So they're the same. And they're going to discuss the impact of systemic inequities on the students related to gifted education. Through multiple modalities, they're going to discuss what the giftedness looks like in the NANIP culture and how giftedness presents differently. They're going to use case studies and scenarios to reflect on real world examples and make connections. And then provide opportunities for job embeddedness, looking at current student profiles and really being able to take what they're doing. And again, this is a characteristic of a best practice in professional learning, this job embeddedness, looking at current student profiles and connecting this content from these zones to their students. The third PLC, remember, is taking on some of these facilitator duties, as well as gaining new knowledge through multiple modalities to really extend on what they know about the population, getting in deeper through small groups or one-on-one. And they're also going to make those job embedded connections to the work with the student profiles, so that they're again having that job embeddedness. And Katie's going to take us through zone 3.
Zone 1 and 2 really focuses on the beginning part, right? And a lot of school districts spend a lot of time focusing on increasing their identification numbers and getting these kids into the program. But what we found in our research is that the problem comes, we get these kids identified, but now we're trying to serve them with the same curriculum that we've always had and doing things the same way. But that's not going to work because these kids are coming from different cultures and different communities. And so when they get into these programs, they may not be as successful. I mean, think about if you identify an ELL gifted kid, they're going to need some language supports as they come into your curriculum. So zone 3 really focuses on how do we support these kiddos once they get identified and they're in our classroom, but also how do we support our teachers who are working with these kids? So what strategies can we bring into the table for them that can help them better adapt their gifted curriculum? You know, what resources are there already out there for them in the schools? So here, if we're thinking about our student, Shiloh, you know, she's coming in, he's going to need some supports in the classroom after being identified. This zone also really looks at partnering with other people and resources that we already have in the school building. So our language specialists, do you want to flip the slide? So here we see we've split into 3 groups again. So you can, again, of course, vary as you go. So for our first group, we're going to talk about what supports we really have out there, you know. So do we have our e-language teacher support? Do we already have different materials that are differentiated that we could bring into the classroom? We're looking for things that are actionable and practical in the classroom that will support our students. And this goes as far as having some practice lesson planning workshops, so we can bring in our 5E lesson plan that we're already using and look at it to see how can we adapt this to include cultural characteristics of the NANIP group. And then going back and thinking about it as we move forward. And the second group, we're doing a similar thing, but here we're going to dive a little bit deeper. And so we're going to also think about front loading. So front loading is a strategy where we are going to start providing some of the services and opportunities and experiences that maybe these kids are missing due to circumstances. So before identification, we're going to provide a bridge program where they can have some opportunities to build some critical thinking skills. They're going to get exposure to different things and talking about things that we can pull in from the community. Zone 3, though, is not just for the teacher support. So we're also thinking about what can we do to support our students. So here we're talking about identifying mentors, whether it's a peer within your gifted program or a teacher mentor, or reaching out into the community and looking for mentors that would be appropriate for our students. And it's really important to have mentors that are scaffold. So, it's great to bring attention to those in our current society, famous people, and drawing attention to that. But famous people you can't really connect with on a one-to-one basis. So it's really important to have a local leader that you can connect with. Our PLC 3 group, they already are aware of some of our resources. And so now they're going to sort of facilitate along with you as helping our 1 and 2 groups, dive into modifying the curriculum, talking about strategies that they're already using, but also thinking about how we can revise our gifted curriculum program overall to better serve our marginalized student groups. And then our 4th zone comes here. And remember, with the zones, we can double back, right? So if in zone 3, as you're going through the curriculum, you as the facilitator start to notice that some of your teachers aren't quite there yet with some of the cultural pieces, so you double back to zone 1 and then move forward again. I think that's really important. It's not a checkbox. I've done this professional learning. I don't ever have to go back because we know in real life we're going to have to go back. So planning for it, acknowledging it is perfectly fine. So zone 4 here, we're looking for partnerships, and we know as teachers that those partnerships are really crucial to the long-term success of our children. I always think of the triangle with the parent, the student, and the teacher, and if one of the legs of the triangle aren't there, it really hurts the student. So here we're talking about how do we develop those partnerships with our community for the gifted program. Obviously, you may have some partnerships already developed for the whole school, but how can we pull the focus to gifted? Because we know gifted does get put to the side sometimes. So with Shiloh, we're going to reach out and look for some NANEP support. So here again, we have our 3 groups. And so we want to make sure that we're not just having those PTA nights where we invite the community members in, or we have our learning night when we invite everybody in, the open house night. There's stagnant one-night events, and those are events where I'm the teacher and I'm giving you information. That's not a partnership. A partnership is where we have equal say and we have equal buy-in. And so we need to reach out to our community members as partners and say, we really want your support. We need your support. What kind of feedback do you have? What events do you have going on that we can support as well? So reaching out to the community members, the leaders in the group, starting those conversations with partnerships. And some of this would be you as the coordinator, but our gifted classroom teachers can do this as well. It's really important that they are also open to having an equal partnership. And here we talk about funds of knowledge and how we can capitalize on those and bring them into our classroom. Because funds of knowledge are very important, and we know that there's different strengths for everybody, and that depending on where we're coming from, we're going to bring in different strengths into the classroom. We also want to think about long-term success, not just short-term success. We don't want a plan a lot of events and then to have them one and done. We want to think about what can we do this year, what can we do for the next 3 years, and where we want to be in 5 years as well.
Sorry, I muted myself because of my cat. So that goes through the full model, which is, again, the 4 zones as we go through. As Katie just mentioned, please keep in mind it is absolutely an iterative process, and we go back and forth and up and down and bounce around like that pogo stick right there. But we go through, it's purposeful in terms of the iterative process. And in the book, we have a sample plan. Not that you have to follow it exactly, but the professional learning playbook gives sample activities. It's actually, in each chapter, it's actually maybe 20 pages of activities and 10 pages of chapter, if not 30 pages of activities and 10 pages of chapter. I mean, the chapters are really, it's activity. It's the playbook is the purpose of it is those activities and how to go about doing some of these trainings. But the goal really is almost to set it up as a purposeful iteration. So, it's actually saving some of these activities to make sure to go back to, because you're going to set it up to make sure to say, okay, I'm going to save this one because I want to make sure I go back to this zone 1 activity during zone 3, or this zone 1 activity during zone 2. And so the iterative piece is really important to make sure you're building that in. It's not a just in case, it's a purposeful iterative process. And so that is it for us. Please keep in mind that the book is coming soon. It's going to be out in spring 2023. It is intended for anyone who will be doing professional learning. So gifted educators who do the professional learning at their school level, administrators who do the professional learning at their district, at their school level, or district administrators at their district level, college professors, anyone who just likes a book with skin colored pencils on the cover. It's for you too. So please reach out and contact us if you have any questions. We love to talk to people, and this is, like I said, all based on work. Katie and I mentioned all based on work that is our research that we do the training of. This is what we do, and so we are happy to help and answer questions, and reach out if you have any. I hope you've enjoyed the NAGC online version. We apologize that we were not able to make it in person, but remember, you have this for 6 months, so please take advantage. Have a great day.